going to, if we can settle down or move or whatever, we can get on with the session. I'd just like to make a point. I don't know whether, John Jones, are you here? Oh, there you are. I just wanted to thank John Jones for standing in for Mandy Banton, who a few days ago seemed to contract something in the Cameroon and couldn't have chaired that meeting. John is responsible for the Kenneth Kaunda film, and he and I and Susan Williams met in Oslo six weeks ago on the eve of John leaving for this long tour through Africa and the Middle East. And he was at this moment leading us through the inauguration of the Dag Hammarskjöld Peace Garden in a small bit of land near Oslo, ceded by Norway to Sweden as thanks for its work in its post-war reconstruction. And John said, well, I think I might be able to organise a meeting with Kenneth Kaunda, or maybe a video. And he had such a busy programme. And somehow, John, you squeezed it into your programme to arrange all that. And I think all of us ought to thank you for that. We in the United Nations are a campaigning organisation. We're not an academic group at all. And it was a privilege to be here, and the very first meeting we shared with the School of Commonwealth Studies was to mark the 50th anniversary of Dag Hammarskjöld's death. I've just spoken about him. And this was a meeting which concluded with a drink session, as ours will, at which moment Susan Williams' book, Who Killed Hammarskjöld, was launched. And that led to a sequence of events, which I won't dwell on now, but allowed us in the United Nations Association to lead an open letter demanding the reopening of the inquiry into Hammarskjöld's death, based on the strength of Susan's arguments in her book. In 2014, we got the General Assembly of the United Nations to agree to reopen it. And since then, there have been 2 more General Assembly resolutions. A book launched at one of these joint meetings has led to the General Assembly of the United Nations reopening this inquiry. And it's so depressing that when earlier this week the United Nations reported on the progress of its inquiry, the United Kingdom had rudely not even opened the envelope from the United Nations Secretary General saying, please help me. Other countries have, but this country has not. And then when it comes back to the point, Madam, you were making about who cares, who is actually in the white community, shall we say, looking at the development of Africa and what our participation, what parts we played in it might have influenced what has gone right or gone wrong. And there we are taking I would say, a very haughty post-colonial approach to this issue, which means an awful lot to Africa. And as far as we, the campaigning group leading this campaign, to make sure we want to get to the truth of what happened. And we actually, in UNA Westminster, we run the website which tells the world what's happening. Just wanted to stress, you do not have to be African to care about what's happening in Africa. Our second conference was with the Institute was on the 60th anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing. How interesting that was, and here we are now for the third. With the United Nations observation, in that same year, 1958, the UN Economic Commission for Africa was set up, and John was speaking about the initiative of Hammarskjöld, feeling that the UN ought to actually take some initiative and not see it taken again in a latter neo-colonial way by European countries. And a few days ago, some of you might have followed the latest debate in the General Assembly as to enlarging the Security Council. And we've both been looking at the contributions made by African delegates to the United Nations, trying to press the point that Africa should have permanent members on the Security Council. I can't say we've made much progress, but the concept of Pan Africanism did shine through. But what's the obstacle there? Of course, it's nationalism itself. No agreement between its countries exactly which should be represented. Now, it's good that with us we have representatives from the High Commission for Nigeria and for the embassies of Algeria and Sudan. But I remember putting stamps on 40 envelopes to High Commissions and embassies, and they're not here. Why is that? We're pleased that this is the event in Britain which is mirroring in a small way what's happening in Accra over 3 days. But nothing else is happening. We haven't actually had embassies or high commissions ringing us up and saying, don't you think this important event should be marked? So, in this context, in this session, reaching out to a wider world, and in this interconnected world that we have, you ask the question, who's listening? But in Pan Africanism terms, who is it who's calling? Who are they? I'm introducing first Joseph Amamu. There we are. And I have to tell you a story that Joseph and Patricia Rogers, my good friend in the United Nations Association, who is a mathematician and tackles these competitions and these analytical challenges with great precision, were talking to Joseph at the beginning, and he said that, yes, he's very proud, he's got 12 boys. So Patricia's thinking exactly sort of, well, of course, there must be a riddle here. You must have had twins, I guess, and triplets. Oh, he said, no, 12 separate boys. In fact, I've got another one coming. The midwife has been called. And I looked at Patricia's face and said, how do we work this one out? Until we realised that his definition of his boys are actually his books. But before you ask the question, madam, Joseph, before I ask you to speak, why do you call your books boys, not girls?
For one reason, first of all, I must say I'm very pleased to be here. Seldom do I get the chance to go to an academic ambience, so I'm so uplifted. The point is this, I had 2 natural daughters, and to date, five grandchildren, and I always said to myself, maybe the Almighty felt that my boys should be represented as books. That's how I started calling them my sons. And once or twice, it's got me into trouble. Somebody asking me, have you been looking after them well? For one reason or another, they don't stay with me. They are in libraries and bookstores. Then they get the joke.
Thank you very much. Well, please continue.
Anyway, the idea of African personality had been bandied about for some time before Nkrumah took it over. He wasn't the first, but he was the one in the political position to make people realize the importance of being an African and to be proud of it. Up till then, as a result of the colonial period, people had lost confidence in themselves and were even ashamed to be called either African or black. So Nkrumah, just before independence and after, always emphasized the African personality, by which it meant Africans being proud of themselves, their background, their heritage, their language, their culture, and everything which went to make them Africans. To the extent that they encouraged people to drop their long English-sounding names like mine, Joseph Godson and all that, and take on African names. So practically the whole cabinet, including Lord Wharton's father, who was the Minister of Interior, equivalent to, let's say here, Home Secretary, they all took African names. And Nkrumah encouraged the people to know that, look, as he often said, what the white man did in 1,000 years, we can do in 100 years. Trying to inspire the people, because as I've said, they had lost all confidence in themselves, and to some extent you couldn't blame them. If all around you, you've been told day and night that you are inferior, you are stupid, you are lazy, you can't think, you can't do this, and to buttress it, you have all around you the evidence that the cars, the aeroplanes, and the machines were all made by white people. It's quite natural to believe that indeed You really are just what you have been told, that you can't do this, you can't do this. So the idea of promoting African personality was an antidote to what was then called the colonial mentality. When people had been so brainwashed that they could see nothing good in the black person and could see nothing bad in the white person either. And it was a Herculean task trying to reprogram people, the whole nation, and then later on Africans in general, that look, this can be done. You're not as you've been told. And that's how the idea of African personality came about, and it was promoted further on outside Ghana itself by encouraging the liberation movements which were then going on. In fact, I'm aware of considerable sums of money which were sent to liberation movements then in East Africa and South Africa to help them to also get independence as we had got. But the point is this, until we, our own Ghana got independence, we were not in a position to help the rest. And that's why again and again Nkrumah emphasized that. Seek ye first the political kingdom, and the rest shall follow. Misquoting the Bible or translating one from another. But the point is this, having got independence, he felt that the African personality or the African wasn't complete unless other Africans too were lifted up. It's like a family of 5 siblings. It's no point one having gone to Oxford or Cambridge or London University when the rest are sitting all in the village. He felt that the brother or sister who gone forward had a moral responsibility to help to uplift the rest. So he spent quite a lot of money helping people outside movements, outside Ghana, and even in the United States of America. A lot of people were encouraged to come to Ghana to settle. Among them was Dr. Du Bois, as you've heard, and Maya Angelou, who later on became a very famous writer in the United States, started originally in the Gold Coast. And I happened to have met her once at the Ghana University where she was working. And to show that Nkrumah's promotion of the African personality didn't mean being anti-white. Not at all. In fact, he encouraged a lot of white people, mostly from Britain, to come and help in Ghana. Would you believe it? Lawrence of Arabia, his younger brother, who was then professor of classical archaeology at Cambridge University, resigned to come and work in Ghana to help to build the country. Britain's only woman Nobel Prize winner, Dame Dorothy Hodgkin, professor of biochemistry, was a visiting professor at the Ghana University, and her husband, Dr. Thomas Hodgkin, was advisor to Dr. Nkrumah. Jeffrey Bing, a former Labour junior minister who had lost his seat, later on joined the campaign for Ghana independence and was appointed Attorney General. Quite born blue-eyed. So it wasn't a question of being anti-white or so. And in fact, Nkrumah went to the extent that he even encouraged biracial marriages. Here was a person who was campaigning all the time for the African personality and independence, and generally was portrayed as being anti-white. But it wasn't so. In his heart of hearts, it just happened that the colonialists at the time happened to be Caucasian. So it appeared that he was anti-white, but in reality he wasn't. When the foreign minister of Ghana at that time refused me permission to marry a white woman, would you believe it? Nkrumah overruled his own foreign minister and a close personal friend and said, go ahead, you have my full blessing. And in fact, jokingly added, send me a bit of the wedding cake. I call this to show that the struggle was against an ideology, against what was manifestly wrong, but it wasn't a question of race or so. And I hope my young friend from Scotland is here. When he said that he didn't see a lot of black people on the panel. I'm afraid, young man, I told him earlier that he was wrong. First, in my view, and I'm entitled to my view, in my view, the panel is well balanced. Second, you get writers like Susan Williams and others who have taken on courses that many black academics wouldn't take up for fear. It's as simple as that. So, some of us feel morally obliged to make the correction, to rectify it, that the issue isn't having how many black people on the panel or how many black people spoke. We passed that stage. One goes by what the person did or said more than the skin color. Because many a time, many Africans too get it wrong. They get it wrong that there have been some white people who have taken up the causes of black people in a way and manner which have cost them their lives. Ruth First, South Africa during the apartheid struggle, I met her. Later had a parcel bomb and died. Her husband, Joe Slobo, lost an arm all over fighting against apartheid. Now when you have these cases and a few others, how can one sit there and not rectify any view that any young man may have that there's something wrong because I didn't see many black people on the panel or this or that. Anyway, so that corrected, I come back to this issue of the African personality on the world stage. After independence, many of the African countries were struggling because the colonial masters had left. So they were more or less operating as if they hadn't got their independence. I remember very well as ambassador in Budapest and Vienna. Once I called in the code book and I found that the code book came from Britain. At the bottom was HMS, Her Majesty's. I said, no, if you have your code book made by somebody else, it's ridiculous and naive and almost tantamount to stupidity to say that you are tapping the phone of the very person who gave you the code book. So many a time I try to correct my people. I said, look, use your energies and time on something more important. But to think that you're going to narrow, you're just wasting a lot of time. So many of the problems which many of the African governments had initially were to be expected because they weren't used to this. The whole environment was new. But let's say 10 years after independence, no African country has any excuse to say that the white man forced me to sign this contract, the white man forced me to, or MI6 this or so. They are all in a position to take decisive actions and be responsible for themselves. This is a continent which is the richest in the whole world. No continent, I repeat, no continent is as rich as Africa in terms of natural mineral resources. Even the Sahara, the largest desert in the world and the hottest. In 2010, a group of geologists from London University discovered vast quantities of water under the Sahara. And apart from the solar energy, there are vast opportunities there. So if the African personality now on the world stage is diminished or isn't as it should be, I do not blame the white man anymore. We blame them for the period till independence, and a few years after independence. After that, Africans are responsible for their own fate and can blame nobody. Like me, I'm responsible for my actions. You cannot expect to do certain things and then blame somebody else. I remember a few years ago, I asked the Ghana finance minister, I asked him, is it true? I just then come from America. Is it true that IMF has caused all the trouble here in Ghana? No. And this is the Ghana finance minister, well-trained, educated, enlightened. He said, no, it's all not true. we do bad things ourselves. I'm paraphrasing what he said. We do bad things ourselves, and then we invite the IMF in, and then we start saying that the IMF wants us to do this, the IMF wants us to do this. It's as simple as that. Why doesn't IMF go to China and force them to do anything? It's all because we create the situations that call for certain interventions. Otherwise, short of military invasion, how can any country just force any other country in Africa, say South Africa or Nigeria, that we're making you sign this contract or so? Any African leader, after independence, allow 10 years or so for a period of infancy. After that period, who signs an agreement or contract which is lopsided and not fair to his own country or people, knows very well what he's doing. Many of them were educated here, some in Sorbonne, Hamburg, Berlin, Harvard. So they can't excuse that they didn't know what they were doing or anything, like my father's generation. So all I can say is this: the African perspective is on. Africans must have confidence in themselves, but in the process, just as happened with Nkrumah, non-Africans who want to help Africans to develop their resources, their vast resources, which no other continent has, are welcome. Then, as in Nkrumah's time, as now, Caucasians, white, I never like to use the term white, because as you all know, as George Bernard Shaw said, at the end of the day, we are not white, we are pink. This is George Bernard Shaw. So seldom do I like to use it, but in the absence of better vocabulary, we use the term white. All white people who are interested or have the passion to help Africa shouldn't feel drawn back because they don't have a lot of melanin in their skin. Thank you very much indeed.
I turn now to Dr. Chinyo. At your point, I spoke earlier about our campaign to reopen the Hammarskjöld investigation. This is the first time, Knox, we've met, but you were one of the very first people to stand up and say we're with you in the campaign. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the Institute, to Susan Manley Phillip, and also to the Westminster United Nations Association for inviting us here. I'm going to just talk at random a little bit about African defense and security issues from the time of the 1958 conference, looking and the evolution through the OAU and the African Union. I'll just pick up one or 2 points. First, just in terms of the context of 1958, just a couple of interesting points. I think for me, and I wasn't there, I'm literally a child of the 60s. I remember the 60s very well, but 1958 was a little bit before my time. But I would say the AAPC conference of 1958 really was the parent of modern Africa, of the OAU. It was the parent of the African Union. It was really the parent, I would say, of African identity, even now as we speak, and the African voice. Because in many ways, it Africanized the Pan Africanist movement. It was the first real major time that we're having a Pan Africanist conference in Africa with core Africans speaking, people of course from all over the world, but I think it was really a seminal moment in the whole Pan-Africanist evolution of Pan-Africanism, because it was a pivot to Africa in terms of Pan-Africanism. So I think we cannot overstate the importance of this conference in terms of the African identity and the African voice right up until the present day. Just another interesting thing, just in terms of the conference, is that, as has been mentioned, I think, by other speakers, there was the participation not just of African political leaders, heads of state, but also of African trade unions, of African people. So this was a conference in which they were making clear that for now and as Africa decolonizes, it must be as much about the African people as about the African leaders. And this has been a continuous thread going through right from 1958 to the present day, both in terms of opportunity and achievements in having the African voice heard, but also as a challenge and as a tension. How do we bridge that gap between the leaders and the people? And I think in 1958, both explicitly and implicitly, there was that challenge that when we have these conferences, when we get together to deliberate, where is the voice of the peoples of Africa and not just the leaders and the well-known leaders? Where's the voice of the ordinary people? And this, I think, is something that we're still engaging with right now in the present day. In terms of kind of the military or security aspects of 1958, I think one of the interesting things which was also implicit there is what was going to... I mean, there were two kind of security dimensions in the conference. One was the liberation and armed resistance in really oppressed parts of Africa, particularly Southern Africa, and the legitimacy of the armed struggle. And so here we're talking in a sense of the evolution of a new kind of military in Africa. We're talking of new kinds of liberation, new kinds of militaries, which is a departure from the traditional colonial African military. And this is one of the kind of implicit and explicit issues which I think was at the conference. What is going to be the future of African forces, both in the struggle for liberation, in this nationalist moment, and once we've achieved independence, what happens with the African armies? And if we also have liberation armies, how are we going to grapple with that? And I think this was kind of implicit in the conference as well as explicit as well. As has been mentioned elsewhere, I think it was a very, very important moment, the agreeing in the conference, the discussion and agreement on the legitimacy of armed struggle against colonialism and white minority rule. As has been discussed earlier, it was a real discussion. A lot of the African nationalist movement, particularly the trade unions, were rather uneasy at the idea of armed struggle. From my home country, from Zimbabwe, we had two well-known delegates. There were a couple of other delegates, Joshua Nkomo, who would head ZAPU, and Tom Mboya were there. And Nkomo in his book and elsewhere has spoken of what a cathartic moment the 1958 conference was, because it forced him to rethink the entire nationalist struggle. And it forced him and others to realize that where dialogue fails, there may be a need for armed struggle. And the agreement was not that armed struggle must necessarily be the first means of liberation, but where all other methods have failed and there is a necessity, then yes, the armed struggle is necessary. And this was a very, very important moment, I think, not just in terms of 1958 in Africa, but globally as well, because there was the realization, particularly when they had spoken with the Algerian, the FLN, Africans from other parts of Africa left that conference not only feeling that we should have an armed struggle where dialogue has failed, but that you can do it, that you can take on the colonial militaries with all that impressive firepower, with the numbers. Because prior to that, there'd been a sense that, my God, how do we take on these militaries? We don't have arms, these militaries are so well armed, how do we do it? But through that cross-fertilization dialogue across Africa, people left that conference feeling that yes, it's not going to be easy, but we can do this, and we must do this when necessary. And that, I think, was a very, very, that can do, that change from maybe to can do, I think, was a pivotal moment in decolonizing the African mind and going forward into the present. So that was a very powerful moment. But alongside that, with the issue of the liberation struggles, there was the implicit question of post-liberation, what happens with the African armies? Are they going to be on the people's side? Because the African militaries, the police and the armies, traditionally had been there to bolster the colonial system. They were there as a bulwark to protect essentially the colonial state against the African people. They were there to keep the African people in line, in order. And I think from 1958 and onwards into the OAU as well, there was this question of what now happens with the African military. And this would be a question that would continue to resonate, I think, to the president. So I think it was very, very important. I think that particular question was more implicit than explicit, but I think it was a very, very important discussion, and it would go forward into the OAU and the African Union as well. Also very important, which has been mentioned, I think, by Cameron and colleagues here at the table, is that the 1958 conference was not an anti-white event. I think because, and I say this because in some of the archival materials, particularly if you look at some of the Federation documents, it was deliberately misrepresented as an anti-white discussion against the white. So I think it was very, very important, again, that actually it was not anti-white, it was about taking on the system. Now, in terms of the OAU, I'll just talk very briefly. I won't go into much detail about the Organization of African Union itself. I'll just talk about the OAU Liberation Fund, which was a pivotal mechanism for the liberation of particularly of Southern Africa. It was, again, established in 1963 when the OAU met. There was a structure there. There was funding. The funding was never terribly reliable. Many countries committed to fund. They did not always commit. But there were a number of countries, especially, and we have to give thanks to countries like Tanzania, to Ghana, who, despite whatever they were going through in their meager resources, they did continue to give funding to the Liberation Fund. The importance, I think, of the fund is that without the OAU Liberation Fund, it is hard to certainly the struggle for liberation, particularly in Southern Africa, would have taken much, much longer. Also important to note that the OAU Liberation Fund, contrary to some perceptions, was actually quite well organized. Liberation organizations had to report, they had to give reports to the Liberation Fund. In terms of the funding, there was an accountability mechanism within the funding. So it was a structured, it wasn't just haphazard, giving money to anyone and everyone. It was quite a structured mechanism, and it was a very, very important issue. One of the things in terms of the liberation time was that there was a question of, do we do liberation of Southern Africa in sequence, i.e. one country at a time, or do we do it simultaneously? There was quite a discussion on that, and it was decided that, okay, the camps will host different movements, but each movement will be responsible for liberating its own country. So the OAU, I think, played a very, very important role in terms of the Liberation Fund. The OAU did have other shortcomings in terms of the post-colonial era, particularly because the OAU did the question of the tension between sovereignty, or in some ways the obsession with sovereignty, and the principle of non-intervention was a very tricky situation, because it prevented a lot of, it had, I think, a negative impact with regard to governance in Africa. But a lot of this, again, is with hindsight. Part of the reason why there was the obsession with sovereignty and non-intervention is because at the time, in the 60s and the 70s, this was the middle of the Cold War. There was a lot of external interference happening in Africa. So if we contextualize it, we can perhaps start to understand why some of these mistakes happened. In terms of the African Union, They moved now from the principle of non-interference to the principle of non-indifference. In other words, governance is now taking is now moved front and center in the African Union. It's very, very important. So there has been an evolution. There's questions about the structure of African military in Africa. What is the role of the African military? Some of these questions date back to 1958. I think overall, the move towards constitutionalism in Africa has been a big positive. The military is being held to be more accountable. There are still a lot of issues with regard to African militaries, but I think what is important is that the AU, the regional economic communities, are engaging with African security issues, and there's been a move now away from security simply being national security and the security of the state to a broader human security perspective, which I think is very, very important, and which I think resonates with what was talked about in 1958, because the discussion was about development and the security of people. So that discussion, I think, has been a continual one. I think I'm running out of time, but what I would just like to end on is just, if we had a panel of Nkrumah, if they were here in the room on the panel with us, Nkrumah, Nyerere, people who were there in 1958, what are some of the things that they would look back now and think, what have been some of the things that they might have liked since then? What are some of the things they might not have liked? So if they were here, I think they would be happy that the African Union is still there and that it has played a major role in Africa. We can criticize the OAU and the AU by all means, but I think as Africans, if there hadn't been an OAU, an African Union or regional economic community, or some forum or focus for the discussion of Africa, I think would look very different in a more negative way. So I think they would be happy that the AU is there. They would be happy that the African liberation agenda, particularly Southern Africa, was successfully completed. They'd be happy, I think, that the AU has evolved from the obsession with sovereignty and non-intervention to non-indifference. They would be happy, I think, that Africa is moving towards regional and continental economic integration. This is a big agenda. AU Vision 2063 and so on. So this is exactly what was being discussed in 1958 in the OAU summit in 1996. So we're beginning to realize a little bit of in that sense, of Nkrumah's vision of better integration. We're not there yet. It's still an ongoing story. What would they not like? Well, I think they would be unhappy that Africa is still aid dependent. I think that's still an ongoing issue, which was stated then, and it's still an issue now. In Africa, we're still very aid dependent. Sure, we have partnerships with the broader world. We're part of a global economy, but there is still an aid dependency, which actually has been explicit in the African Union itself has said we must move away from aid dependency. But it is a big, long struggle. And I think these are some of the things that you can imagine Nkrumah in particular would have had a lot to say about that. I think they would be quizzical about the migration question. In many ways, I think what we're seeing with migration crisis reflects badly on Africa. It's a failure of governance in many ways. And I think they would be critical of that. Whereas Africans, we have to be honest. Why are people fleeing Africa? It's a question of governance and uneven economic development. So I think Nkrumah and Nyerere certainly would have had a lot to say about that. But I challenge us to turn that around, even the migration. Yes, let us be self-critical about migration. We cannot blame, the West. Let us turn it around and also ask ourselves, why are so many people remaining in Africa? Mm-hmm. Why are the diasporas now re-engaging with Africa? So there are two dimensions to this question, and there's also a sense of African pride. Most people in Africa are staying in Africa, not because they cannot leave, but because they want to be there. There's an African pride and a new Pan Africanism, I think, which is emerging in Africa through Black Lives Matter, through there's a young Pan Africanism,
Yes.
which is emerging, which is re-energizing the traditional Pan Africanism. Part of it has a security component, but I would say our real challenge is to engage with the youth of Africa in the Pan-Africanist struggle. Let's hear the voices of the youth of Africa in the Pan-Africanism. Let's hear the voice of the youth in the security discourse. We need more young voices in there, and particularly the voice, I think it's been alluded to, the voice of women in that, because I read a little bit. To me, the voice of women is either underplayed or, I think we need to hear more of that, particularly in the security discourse. Africa, for instance, only has 2 female defense ministers currently. One of them is Zimbabwean. So these are some of the challenges. But again, I think as an African, we have to say a big thank you to 1958. And also, my last word is that 1958, in presages, in 1960 or 61 in the Congo, there was a notorious statement made by the Belgian commander who said, Africa before independence equals Africa after independence. The conference of 1958 and the subsequent conferences have showed that to be wrong. Yes, we have challenges, but certainly Africa before independence does not equal Africa after independence, and we have to be thankful to 1958 and what has happened subsequently for that. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Knox. Really, those rhetorical questions you asked are such a good introduction to our last speaker in the session. Kofi and I were talking at Richmond Tube Station the other day as to what are the things that he, 2 generations after that conference, can grasp from it. Henry Ford said, history is bunk. Where is that link between those 2 of you who were there and the 2 generations behind you here, who's trying to reach those pieces which show there's a DNA link between you? If he can't, then there's failure. And so, since we met, Kofi, what's been going through your mind?
Greetings, everybody. I'm here to basically share what we discussed at Richmond Tube Station. I thought really hard about the conference of 1958. I've only just heard about it. I heard about it about 2 years ago. I was reading about Fanon and I came across this conference that Fanon attended. I said, wow, we have these kind of leaders in African history, and it's hardly ever talked about. No one mentions the Tom Mboyas, no one mentions the giants of Africa that were at this conference. And I thought, okay, how can we energize the youth of Africa, my generation, to take on the battle? Because the forces that these leaders, these Pan-Africans, the forces that they resisted back in 1958 are even worse than today than they were in 1958. And how do we get young Africans to reconnect and be energized to interact and actually understand the politics and what's happening on the ground in Africa and what's happening, what the contributions of the diaspora in actual liberation of the African continent? Because as far as I'm concerned, I don't think Africa is independent or liberated, because I see the African today is the creation of the European Dr. Frankenstein. Because if you look at the African education, African universities, Africans with PhDs, you see that he's totally disconnected from the reality of Africa. What is education? Education for what? So I are more on the Frantz Fanon line, which is for real struggle for liberation, instead of just talking. For instance, I was born in Francophone Africa. I was born in one of the most repressive totalitarian regimes in the world, which is Togo. Can you imagine this government, the government of Togo, with all its atrocities against the people of Togo, still has international PR companies in Washington working for it, PR companies in London working for it, PR companies in Paris working for it, people in Tel Aviv coming, working for this government. So when you look through Francophone Africa, you'll see that nothing has changed from 2 generations ago, nothing has changed. So I see that this generation, we have to take on the battle again to actually free Africa once and for all. Race has nothing to do with this. It's pure and simple, where our struggle is about controlling African land and resources for the benefit of Africans. So that's where I see the struggle. That conference was so important. That's what it tells me that there is progress and there's sort of regression in history. And I think that conference was a progress, and then we've come to the regression and stagnation of Africa, where we see governments who don't. For instance, the Libyan situation, where the toppling of Gaddafi and the subsequent enslavement of black Africans in Libya, the African Union hasn't really done much about it. African governments, so they speak about Pan Africanism, but you can tell that these people don't really want to be together. They want to be separate. So it's really hard to bring together people who would rather be separate. So I see African governments, so you see East Africa, West Africa, North Africa, South Africa, there's a huge disconnect. Unless you meet those Africans from other parts of Africa in London or Paris or in New York, they don't really know much about what's happening in French West Africa. And I don't really know much of what's happening in Anglophone or the Lusophone Portuguese-speaking parts of Africa. So there's that disconnect. So 60 years for what? What can we show for that 60 years? I think the people before us have done more for Africa than this generation. The people who came after the 1958 conference. So I think I haven't come here to teach anybody anything, except, I'm very grateful for the people who spoke before me, and I think I've learned a lot from you guys, and the struggle continues. I look to continue. Thank you very much.